Folks, if you'll all take a seat, enjoy your food, and welcome to Digestive Disruption. I invite our panelists to sit down and get settled. I'm Tim Franson, and I serve as chair of CPATH's board's Science and Regulatory Committee and am the moderator for today's lunch session. We have a remarkable assembly of pediatric development experts here, and this discussion was prompted by views that the critical mass, the capabilities, and the commitment to pediatric drug development beyond rare diseases is eroding across multiple stakeholders. So whether you agree with that or not, we'll have some interesting discussion in this regard. Last week, I survived a trip to Disney World with 3 of my grandkids. It reminded me of the importance of basic information exchange, and that applies today. So in the spirit of Sesame Street, as the panel wrestles with the title, as you see, Persistent Issues in Pediatric Studies, please consider these 4 themes, beginning with the letter C. I don't have my big bird outfit, but to foresee ways as we move forward with these 4 words. So the first C is change. Our policies and practices for pediatric development are founded in 20th century basis. Is that acceptable? And if not, how must we change? Second C is collaboration, which has been a theme throughout our prior discussions. Are we positioned for synergies or stumbling? Third C, communication of concerns that we have beyond development stakeholders. Are we aligned? And can we be effective? And then the 4th C, construction. How do we review and pursue renewed infrastructure for supporting kiddie kinetics and more? So our distinguished panelists will self-introduce and offer initial views, beginning with Dr. Spielberg, who will provide a historical context. And then I will go to Dr. Noel, who's online but not able to be with us in person. We will then have a question and answer period after each panelist has been able to comment. And we're going to summarize by giving everyone a Disney magic wand. 1 minute at the end of the session to say, what would you change to transform this domain for the betterment of pediatric drug development? So without further ado, Stephen, would you take the floor?
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here today, and you'll notice we're a somewhat aged panel, and so it's good to be anywhere today. But what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes, I'm a pediatric clinical pharmacologist. I was in academia. I was in industry and served as deputy commissioner at the FDA as well. I've been a medical school dean. But probably the most relevant thing was back in the last millennium, 1990s, Tim and I worked together as co-conspirators to try to get passage of the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act through Congress. And we've been working together ever since on issues of trying to establish a way of very simply, and that's probably the key message here, of increasing the priority of the needs of children amidst all the other priorities that exist. And we'll go through some of that. So this group got together initially because of some concerns about changes proposed in BPCA and in the rare disease voucher program. Change is okay. These things are not in stone, and we never considered them to be in stone when we first worked to get them passed. We had considered them experiments, and based on good and new data, how to modify things. So what we're going to do today is talk not about, change being bad, but rather about opportunities to develop plans to ascertain the needed data to assure the future of assuring the priority needs of children for optimum therapeutics. And by the end of the panel, suggest some ways of attacking both the strategic and tactical approaches that are going to be needed from legislation, regulatory change, clinical and clinical trial optimization for pediatrics going forward. So, context. Tim and I began, we were both in industry at that time, and were asked to think about participating in a group to look at the possibility of pediatric advance through the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act. And at that time, we realized, yes, children were being orphaned, as Harry Shirky talked about in the 1960s, most drugs not being studied in children, not because anybody didn't like children, but because there were multiple barriers to it, including financial on the part of sponsors who were responsible to their shareholders, to others, and to the general public expecting new drugs to be developed for other populations. And therefore, we sought ways to increase the priority of the needs of children, given the economic realities of the times. In the 1990s were very different economic times than the current economic times. And that's an important lesson that we learned. Increase innovation in new medicines and move the needs of sick children to the front so that they would not be orphaned again from all the remarkable new developments that were happening in biomedical sciences in the 1990s and beyond. And this included very broad partnerships. In order to get BPCA designed and subsequently through Congress, it took broad partnerships among patients and patient advocacy groups, parents, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the pediatric community and children's hospitals, the FDA, pivotal in all of this, and the pharmaceutical industry. And the concept behind it was not to provide patent extensions to industry as a reward for doing pediatric studies, but as a means of enhancing the priority of pediatric investigation among all the other competing interests that go on, the financial interests, other barriers to doing pediatric studies, and to actually put kids on par with developing medicines for adults. And after extensive negotiations, we went up and back. I can't tell you how many times Tim and I appeared in front of congressional committees, worked together with our colleagues at the AAP, at the FDA, and talking to CEOs of companies, trying to come up with something that would work. And we considered this an experiment. Again, we did not consider it a final solution. We considered it a societal experiment with 5-year periods of review for multiple rounds until the legislation was finally expanded in perpetuity. And at the same time, PREA, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, Bob Ward is here, heavily involved in that, to provide both a carrot and stick that would allow FDA and sponsors to have a more clear guidance and a clear path to the development of medicines. And among the hopes, and we didn't know if it would work, but among the hopes is that we would increase pediatric expertise within industry. I was at J&J at the time. I developed a group that had 8 pediatricians in the therapeutic areas that we were involved in, that would increase the pediatric expertise within FDA. That certainly happened with really talented people coming in, setting up things both within the office of the commissioner and beyond, and to advise the review divisions on pediatric issues. to expand the pediatric investigative capacity within the academic community and the overall investment in pediatric therapeutics. Then we had rare disease vouchers, and we talked about rare diseases today to help deal with rare conditions. I actually talked to a company this week that has one patient with this disease, but it's a unique disease that might be informative for a whole series of other disease processes if we can figure out how to do it. And I think together we accomplished a great deal. Recognizing the realities of the pediatric marketplace, pediatricians are always on the bottom of the heap in terms of their income, never seem to bother us. We're also among the happiest physicians for very good reasons, because we truly believe in our work and because we work on behalf of children more than we work on behalf of ourselves. So BPCA happened. What's the current situation? Well, we are concerned about data driving where we go from here. We certainly were when we enacted BPCA at the beginning. We needed a huge amount of data. We needed to convince CEOs. We needed to convince pediatric hospitals. We needed to convince the government and FDA. And we are at a time of remarkable shifts in the clinical and scientific milieu under which we do pediatric therapeutics, and a time that's shifting dramatically in terms of where dollars are allocated within our society, which makes me nervous as an advocate for kids. At any time in society where there is pestilence, war, famine, okay, the traditional kinds of things, who suffers the most? It's women and children. And without advocacy for both women and children at this time, we do worry. Should we be? Well, the population is aging. When I testified first in front of Congress for BPCA, I sat next to a delightful grandmother and we chatted during the break. And then she came out against BPCA. She represented AARP. And her concern was the cost of her drugs were going up. And if this made the cost of drugs going up for her, we're in trouble. Well, we're a great society, where we pit grandparents against grandchildren's needs. And we have a healthcare non-system with rampant increases in costs of medicines and other aspects of healthcare. And there is a real concern that there will be strain on the system and kids will suffer. We've pulled back on child labor laws in the United States. Is this 1906? And where's Upton Sinclair and the jungle now protecting kids? And we're finding kids working in the meat packing and chicken packing industries like 1906. Have we forgotten so easily? So then we have Medicaid. Over 2 million kids have been bumped from Medicaid in the last few months. That impacts those children. It impacts their families. And folks, it impacts pediatric hospitals. Where do pediatric hospitals get their income? Not from Medicare, heavily from Medicaid. And our beloved Congress, when they decided that residents would be paid from Medicare funds, suddenly had to be informed that wouldn't deal with children's hospitals, and they had to pass different legislation to support residency training. Kids got forgotten. We cannot afford for that to happen again. So thinking about the future and the nature and composition of pediatric disease, genomics, individualized therapeutics. I mean, this is an incredible time. You heard wonderful talks this morning about things that we couldn't have even heard about 10 years ago because we didn't have a clue about them. And the efforts to rationally put together consortia, groups that can address these things. I would posit we are in an urgent period now to advocate for kids. And that doesn't mean picking fights among ourselves about who has a lock on wisdom. Ain't no one does. My favorite Robert Frost couplet is, we dance round in a ring and suppose, but the truth sits in the middle and knows. We got to work together on this, folks. And there's a real concern that as we begin to go forward and consider changes in BPCA, consider changes in statute that may lead to changes in regulation within the agency, changes in the way companies are formed and the way they go after targets, that we need to do this in a data-driven way, which is why Tim and I got into this discussion initially. Can we put together a panel to sort of highlight some of the issues? And then can we go from there to do the hard due diligence to come up with a way of assuring that Harry Shirky's fear of orphan drugs, pediatric orphans, that's not going to happen again. And from everything, just pick up a newspaper, you know that the fear of orphaning children yet again is very real. We need to advocate, but it's not just advocacy. It's having good data to convince ourselves, to convince our partners in government, in industry, at children's hospitals, many of which are in extremis right now in terms of their funding, which means faculty are going to be even less able to do clinical investigation just to keep the doors open. We cannot abandon kids at that point. That's why we have this panel.
Right. Thank you, Stephen. A very impassioned plea, and thank you very much for that. I mean, you got to listen to that and say, former deputy commissioner, dean of medicine, prominent pharmacologist, either he's Superman or he can't hold a job. And obviously, he has been a Superman advocate for children for so many years. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Gary Noel to have his 5 minutes of fame. And
okay.
Have we got you there?
I think you have me. You can hear me?
All good? It's yours.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for including me in this group. And it's been a pleasure working with the people you see on the screen here over the years in trying to address the issues of pediatric drug development. I'm a pediatrician by training and infectious disease subspecialist. I spent about half of my career in academic medicine at New York Hospital Cornell, and then have spent the last half of my career working in large pharma, small pharma, and then most recently as the chief medical officer at the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children. And the reason I've joined this group is to continue to try to address the challenges and opportunities as I've transitioned into more of a consulting role for IACT and other organizations that I'm working with. The challenges as I see it in pediatric drug development have been that while there have been groups that have sort of stepped up, stakeholders that have stepped up and have taken and accepted some of the responsibility for advancing drug development, I think the opportunity that we face in the coming years is to really expand among the stakeholders who are involved in this process, the children's hospitals, the healthcare systems, in addition to the innovators and the drug developers, in accepting those responsibilities to move this effort forward. We did, at the beginning of this, sort of think about ways we saw things perhaps changing. Steve's brought up some of the issues of sort of having to deal with an aging population and meeting their healthcare needs, hopefully not at the expense of staying focused on what we need to do to advance pediatric drug development. My greatest concern, as I faced in the last decade, has really been that we haven't been paying attention to the speed at which these programs are developed. And when I say speed, I'm really talking about the lack of efficiency and the lack of focus that we have in putting these programs together and trying to get these clinical trials completed in a timely fashion, getting products approved and labeled for children. What I'm looking forward to is seeing that as we think about changes that perhaps can be made on the legislative front and from the economic considerations, is to think about ways that we can incentivize across the stakeholders, not just the pharmaceutical companies, but the healthcare systems, the children's hospitals, the clinicians, incentivize this process in such a way that it does make it economically feasible for them to stay engaged in this and to move this effort forward in a feasible manner. I think that's going to require a considerable amount of thought and discussion among a broad spectrum of stakeholders. And I want to point out that some of those stakeholders don't appear or don't attend critical path conferences like this. So I think we as an organization need to think about ways that we can get their attention and get them to speak with us about what they would need to do to be more engaged in it, much along the lines of what I think Tim and Stephen and others did as BPCA and PREA took shape and became the law of the land, thinking about ways that we can modify these programs to further incentivize all stakeholders to stay engaged. I'm usually the pessimist and Steve is usually the optimist when we get together and have conversations. So Steve, I was listening to you and say, boy, that is an uncharacteristic pessimistic message that you were sending. So I'll try to be more optimistic in concluding and saying, I think I'm confident that this can be done. I think there are, as you mentioned, a group of pediatricians who are in this for the right reason, who understand the needs of children and who undoubtedly will step forward and move this field forward. So I look forward to seeing what happens in the next couple of years to continue to build on the success of PREA and BPCA and move this whole effort forward in such a way that we can do this work more efficiently and effectively than we have over the last 2 decades. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Love the theme of shared incentives, and we may come back to that. But Susie, and we'll follow right down the line.
Sure. So I'm really glad, Gary, that you stepped in between me and Stephen so that hopefully everyone in the room doesn't remember his impressive CV when I introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Susie McCune, a neonatologist, about 18 years of academic work, about 18 years at the FDA. My last position at the FDA was the director in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics in the Office of the Commissioner, and have had just a wonderful opportunity to work with everyone here. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But 2 years ago, decided that I wanted to leave the castle of the FDA and figure out how we could maybe do a better job of implementing pediatric trials. So I went to the clinical research organization known as PPD, which is now part of Thermo Fisher Scientific, in the Rare Disease and Pediatric Center of Excellence, where we're really trying to work with both pharma as well as biotech to really move the dial and be able to get these trials done in a timely fashion. And it really involves, collaboration of everyone in the room. I'm going to go down the historical lane for just a second. So one of the things when I was at the FDA that I was involved in was the early launch of ink. And so I just wanted to take your 4 C's, Tim, and talk a little bit about change, collaboration, communication, and construction, because I think we're seeing all of that here today. And historically, Lynn Hudson and Martha Brumfield just were tremendous. But I remember the first time I approached them about ink, and they looked at me like I had 3 heads and went, "That's nice," and kind of ran away. I remember literally chasing them down the hall at the FDA. And they said, "Okay, well, we'll do due diligence," because they knew I wasn't going to go away. And I remember the first meeting that we had at the FDA before the launch, and Janet Woodcock came to give the opening remarks. And if everyone knows Janet, she generally puts a few notes down on paper and then speaks extemporaneously. And the first note she had was, "We've started consortia with as few as 7 people." And then she looked around the room at the 120 people and she goes, "But that's not your problem, is it?" And that was really the beginning of an understanding of how important the neonatal community was and is, both from a collaboration perspective, and for me to be able to see the change that's gone on in the last 7 or so years with respect to ink is phenomenal. So there's your change. And a lot of this depends really on communication and collaboration. And literally the construction of the working groups and the discussion that we just had in the last panel, I think, are really important moving forward. But we have a lot of work to do. But now I'm going to switch gears away from ink for a second and talk a little bit more generically about the pediatric initiatives. And I want to really thank Tim and Stephen for all of their work from a legislative perspective. And Bob and John as well. So both from the BPCA and the PREA perspective. But what did that mean, from an FDA perspective? And where did we start? So Stephen, you mentioned, the therapeutic orphan, and that came about in 1962. Really, it was actually the best of intentions, because what was stated at the time is that drugs not tested in children should not be used in children. The problem was, instead of testing those drugs in children, we just either stopped using the drugs or we continued to use them off-label, not knowing what to do about it. And so, I think that we've come a long way in terms of, figuring out that we really do need the data, both in terms of efficacy and safety, with respect to all the pediatric populations, and especially true that we've been hearing about this morning with rare diseases. In 1997 was first exclusivity followed by BPCA in 2002 and PREA in 2003, and they were made permanent in 2012. 2012 also saw, as we talked about, the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program, which was extended in 2020 and actually is set to sunset at the end of September of next year, 2024. So things to think about in terms of what are the appropriate I'm almost being cut off. I'll get the hook. Thinking about the carrot of BPCA and the stick of PREA, and what are the incentive programs that we need to continue to develop pediatrics. And I know that when we first started the conversation with BPCA, the thought was that the carrot was really going to drive all of the development programs. And unfortunately, the data, we now are starting to get some data, and up through 2021, I think we had a little over 900 labels, of which, if you combined studies that were done under PREA only or BPCA and PREA, I think it was for the total was about 2/3 of the studies were done under PREA or BPCA plus PREA. And I will tell you, having just looked at the statistics again today, the good news is we're up to almost 1,100 pediatric labels now. The bad news is that it is continuing to skew into that PREA realm, where if you combine BPCA, PREA, and PREA alone, it's now 3/4 of the work that's being done for new pediatric labels is being done some capacity under PREA. So I think that we have made a lot of progress. I think the change is that we need to think about, it's almost 20 plus years since we started having these conversations. And the great news is that everything we've heard this morning is that things have changed. We've had tremendous communication. We're developing platforms for data sharing, new approaches that are not just randomized clinical trials, but looking at how we can incorporate natural history data into what we're doing. Very exciting time, but I think we have to move with the times in terms of figuring out what those incentives look like moving forward. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Susan. Some really interesting things to come back to. Dan?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Susie and Stephen, and thanks to the rest of the panel as well. And I mean that sincerely. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to work with you right now. And hopefully, and we know it will happen, we're going to continue to work after this panel disbands, because there's so much that can be done. Let me first tell you a little bit about my background. As I mentioned earlier today, I'm a pediatrician. I'm a pediatric subspecialist, actually, in infectious diseases, and also spent some time doing epidemiology for the Centers for Disease Control, pretty much investigating diarrhea outbreaks on cruise ships and foodborne illnesses and things like that, although I'm sorry to mention that during lunchtime. And then I worked in different biopharmaceutical companies. I spent about 10 years at Pfizer, and mostly on the azolide and macrolide development programs, where I really got a firsthand experience in the trials and tribulations, if you will, and the challenges of pediatric drug development. And then I also was part of working on vaccines at Pfizer until I moved to the smaller biotech companies. And we know at those smaller companies, as much as there is a will to get things done in favor of children, we also know there are extreme financial consequences of doing that. And these companies, as we heard earlier, are really sort of on the brink of existence. And this is sort of a galvanizing time here where we need to come together around pediatric health. And we're talking about pediatric drug development right now, but it really stretches way beyond drug development, as Stephen alluded to. I mean, I was just reading in our Wall Street Journal article yesterday about emergency rooms. And it turns out most of our emergency rooms, including some of our best emergency rooms, and including some at children's hospitals, are not equipped to take care of children during an emergency. They don't have the right equipment. They don't have the right size endotracheal tubes or catheters or things like that. In the middle of an emergency or a code, they're getting adult doses. And so as a result, there have been several deaths. Actually, they estimate in the hundreds due to these problems in emergency rooms. And it turns out that most of the states don't even have certification programs for the pediatric part of emergency care. So this is a widespread problem. And then I'm going to loop back a little bit to what I was mentioning earlier about my work in antibiotics at Pfizer. And it was a very important time. This was a couple decades ago, so I'm aging myself. But we saw some of the issues then that we're talking about now regarding the challenges of drug development in general, but also some of the more specific challenges of recruitment of pediatric patients, making sure they're the right patients, making sure that we get the right endpoints, all of those things that I think everyone is familiar with. But I want to also say that even though we're identifying these gaps, we have made some progress, and that is important, because I've heard among the panelists so far the importance of data-driven solutions, and really that's what CPATH is all about. And I started at CPATH about a year ago, and it's just been a pleasure working with the people who are there, and they're so committed to health in general, of course, but also pediatric health. And so on their behalf, I want to thank everyone who's here today for not just their participation in this meeting, but all the work you're doing on behalf of patients, including pediatric patients. And then also to feel free that if you have any questions, or if we at CPATH can do anything for you, just let us know. But getting back to the data-driven part of it, you saw the talk earlier today by Klaus, who's our chief science officer, about model-informed drug development, and in particular, disease progression models and dropout models. And I think these are extremely important things. And we're very happy to be part of that now. And we have plans to keep expanding in that realm. But I will say that, again, looping back to the experience with antibiotic development, that so much of our conversation at that time with the regulators was around missing data. So when we talk about the dropouts, I also worry about the patients who stay in the trial but have missing data, and how we can deal with that. And I think we're developing greater statistical methods of dealing with that. And then I guess the final thing I would say, and this is something that AJ had brought up earlier, is that as part of this sort of evolving environment where the kids are getting lower and lower on the chain or the ladder, excuse me for a second. As part of this, we just basically have to invest in infrastructure, but also the political component of it, and also the medical component of it. I think, as I was saying about AJ, he mentioned that of all the physicians of today, about 5% of them are pediatricians, and that's way too low. And we need more pediatricians. We need more people in general working in the area of pediatric health. And then finally, the collaboration part that Tim had mentioned, again, I think everyone realizes that also is something that is very important to CPATH, that we lead collaborations, and that, again, we thank you for being part of those collaborations, and we look forward to working with you even more. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Now to my fellow Hawkeye.
So, I listen to all of this, and I'm not sure whether to be depressed or not, which is why they asked me to be on the panel, because I'm a child psychiatrist to try and help all of you. Actually, I am a child psychiatrist. I find I'm often the only child psychiatrist in these discussions, which is an issue in and of itself. I'm also active in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, which is going on right now. And I think that one of the things we need to think about is how do we build some bridges, more bridges there between pediatrics and child psychiatry to address some of these issues, because the same problems are occurring in child psychiatry as occur in pediatrics generally. And I think one thing we discovered during the pandemic was not only is it important to think about the infectious disease and treatments that way, but it's also important to think about kids' mental health, and that we're still recovering from that. There's going to be a lag effect and an impact there that, I feel I need to mention that because it's an important concern of mine, but I think it's also a concern nationally. So I'm also a pharmacologist, which makes me a real odd duck. And then in addition to being a pharmacologist, my hobby used to be bioethics and such, until I ended up on the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections and on the board of Primer and things like that. And I've sort of became I don't know what I am as far as bioethics, but I do it a lot. And while I was at Lilly for 20 years, I helped create the infrastructure, did pediatric work the whole time, but helped create the infrastructure for our pediatric center of excellence, and really helping to bring all things together, not just drug development, but also thinking about things like the bioethic or the ethics component, thinking about the safety components, and dealing with regulatory policy as part of that. And so I contributed to both the 2012 and 2017 pediatric legislation. And, you know, so I did all that stuff, and I've seen a lot of, I've also developed drugs globally and had drugs approved in Japan and done trials in Japan as well as in Europe and elsewhere. What's impressed me is, one, the willingness of people to work together on pediatrics. I think you see that here, the collaboration of everyone. Very different systems, very different problems in many cases on a regional level, but still this willingness and this recognition that pediatrics were a small focus, and we can actually get much more done when we work together. I was observing to someone the other day that, you know, one of the companies that I've interacted with has a pediatric center, and they have you know, about 7 or 8 people that are focused on doing creating a network and supporting a network. I've become chief medical officer for Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children. One of our efforts is to create a pediatric network of networks to try and deal with a variety of trials across specialties. And we serve a number of different companies, but we have that same number of people. You know, essentially, we're helping to make things more efficient for pediatrics by you know, making it so that companies don't have to focus on some of those things potentially, but can focus on really thinking more about how do we do the regulations well and that. And one thing, you know, I have to echo Stephen's comments. Things have changed dramatically over the years. The assumptions that were kind of in place about how things are done with the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act aren't necessarily relevant in today's world. You know, the 6 months of pediatric exclusivity, you know, what does that mean to a biotech that is focused on a pediatric disease? They get the drug approved and then they're bought by a major pharma, and, you know, it never, you know, who knows what happens at that point. It becomes something for the major pharma, but it doesn't really, you know, benefit the biotech or the folks working on it at the time. We had during COVID, I was involved in some of our work with monoclonal antibodies to treat COVID, and pushing on people, you know, emphasizing we need to think about kids with this, even though kids were not a large group of the patients involved. And, you know, one of the things I was really concerned about was there's a lot of uncertainty. And, you know, frankly, there was no incentive there from the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children perspective, because, you know, here we are, 3 years later, and basically those drugs are useless at this point in time. The virus has evolved out of it, and so the 6 months of pediatric exclusivity wouldn't mean anything. So there really weren't incentives to go into pediatrics other than PRIA. And, you know, I'm a child psychiatrist, okay? A lot of what you deal with in child psychiatry is incentives for 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, stuff like that, but there's still incentives. The cudgel, you know, beating a child doesn't work in terms of motivating them. They're motivated by rewards and such. You can get a child to do amazing things for just points or stickers. I hate to say it, but pharmaceutical executives aren't necessarily that different from those kids in terms of the same sort of behavioral approaches work. And we need to be open and think about different ideas. How can we do this different? Because if we don't do it different, we're going to continue to struggle, I think, in some of these ways. And there's going to be gaps. And we need to focus on how can we do it better? How can we do it different? And we need to be open to those possibilities. And I think that's really one of the things that I'm hoping we'll start to get out of this initiative.
Thanks, AJ. And John, you've been a leader from the academic perspective, so we're looking forward to that.
Thanks very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And so keeping with your letter of the day of C, it is interesting having watched Sesame Street for so many years with my own kids and then took a 30-year hiatus and now watching it again with my grandchildren. So the similarities, a lot of things have changed, but a lot of things still similar. So again, you've heard a lot about the issues of collaboration. And recently, there was a big symposium at Duke with a lot of our colleagues in neonatology there. And someone had developed their monoclonal antibody, and it seemed to be quite good at preventing radiation-induced injury. So, of course, it was quickly picked up by the Defense Department, and they're testing it in some of the animal models. But this person said, gee, I wonder, oxidant injury, radiation, oxidant injury, BPD, maybe I can try some animal models of BPD. And she tried it, and it seemed to work. And so she said, well, what do we do now? And this was Mary Sunday that Judy knows. And someone said, well, gee, why don't you call John Davis up? Because he knows a lot about drugs and the FDA and stuff like that. And maybe he can help you. And so it was interesting that what we've built at Inc. Is a mechanism of at least talking about things and being able to provide advice and input. And from the academic standpoint, the best things for me are the collaboration, because none of us can do this on our own. Absolutely none of us. And I agree with AJ where 20 years ago, as I would go to the FDA to specifically talk about drug development, you got a very much of a wall, and there were certain things you could talk about. There were certain people you could talk about. It really didn't involve pediatricians. It never involved a neonatologist, and that clearly has changed. And that part really makes me the happiest and positive and recognizing that there's opportunities in the future. When I can reach out to colleagues, Ann Massaro and Office of Pediatric Therapeutics, Jerry Bear, others, when Susie was there, to just ask questions, to talk to Ralph Bax at EMA or folks at Health Canada. I mean, that makes a difference when there's that opportunity to interact. Sometimes to say, gee, one of our company members have reached out to me because they've gone to EMA and FDA and they can't agree on the same outcome measures for the same trial. That's going to be done in both places. And so then they're able to talk about it and discuss it, and many times come to more of an agreement on what that should be. So I think that's a positive. I think from the academic community, we've had a lot of our colleagues put their time, energy, and effort. And we are really all overburdened between increased clinical care, and et cetera, and trying to find protected time for young investigators to really learn how to conduct clinical research. It's just not a priority at the academic medical centers as much anymore as it used to be. And we have to be fiercely protective of that. But that's the complication, that we're dealing with. But I don't think anyone would have thought that we could sit with the regulators and with industry people, with nurses and parent groups, and really learn from each other. And that's the thing I'm most positive about, is that we have opportunities that Critical Path has given us in this space to learn from each other. The FDA also funded us to do our real world data project. And that was a lot of work, but we have almost 400,000 patients in our data set. And I think that's going to provide us a unique opportunity to really get a lot more accomplished in this space. And everyone now is reaching out to us saying, well, we'd like to use that. The regulators would say, gee, wouldn't it be nice to know in different regions what the background rates of complications are? Industry is saying, well, could that help us design our trials? Could we develop best practices and other approaches in the academic community to use those kinds of data? Could we use it to facilitate clinical trials and make them run faster, smoother, and more efficiently? And I have to agree with AJ. COVID showed that we can do this. I mean, these processes are slow, inefficient, expensive, and everybody complains, and myself included, when I get a form from a drug trial and I had to sign the same form and date it 18 separate times. And I counted each one of them, and it made no sense to me. I just was told there's compliance issues. You have to do this. But we could do it during COVID. I mean, we really made some enormous scientific advances in a very short time. So we can do it if we need to. So I think I'll keep that positive vibe going and say we need to carpe diem, seize the opportunity, and continue to build upon what we've done so far and continue to move that forward.
Thanks, John. Very nice. We've probably got time for our lightning round. With your bibbidi boo little magic wand, just mentioning so that we touch on it, some of the repeated themes about sustainability, shared efforts, and shared incentives. Those are important things to capture. But what about our next steps? How do we not go away saying, this was a great discussion, we heard from a lot of folks, but where's it going? So 1 minute. I'm going to start with John. Wave the magic wand. What would you do to change the environment to improve?
I would, if I had my one wish, it would be to improve access and improve the health inequities in our system. We talk a lot about drug development. We're talking about gene and cell-based therapies, and it's really tremendous excitement with improved diagnostics and gene sequencing. And how do we bring that to the broader community? So we recently had a baby in our NICU with severe hypotonia, wasn't moving, and we knew it was some type of genetic problem, but the insurance company refused to pay for it. So we sent it anyway, and it was a form of severe muscular dystrophy, and the child was likely not going to be able to survive. And we called the insurance company back and we said, well, here's the answer. And they said, well, we still won't pay for it. Now, they were willing to pay for muscle biopsies and 6 MRIs and hundreds of thousands of dollars of diagnostics, but they wouldn't pay for that one test. So I worry about that, as you heard Stephen talk about the children being moved off Medicare. How are we going to get access to all these different communities for these advanced diagnostics? And even more so, how are we going to get these treatments to these children who need them, but can't afford to pay for them because they either don't have insurance or the insurance won't cover these treatments?
Great thought. AJ, you're...
So one of the things that IAC that we're concerned about is the pediatric gap. The gap between when you have an approval for adult indications versus the first approval for children. That's currently around 9 years. It varies a lot from drug to drug and such, but it's 9 years. I like to call those 9 years of the Wild West because people are using the drug off label. They're using, who knows what dose they're using, what they're following and stuff. It just is a difficult period. And it's a public health problem. So how can we shorten that? When I was at Lilly still, there was an effort to shorten clinical development time overall. And one of the biggest things that contributed to the time lags in drug development was white space. The time between studies, when you were doing regulatory discussions, there were discussions about how to approve something, how to approach things. And one of the simplest things that was done helped to shorten that timeline by about 50%. And that was to eliminate white space, to start doing things in parallel, to start thinking about how can we work on something before we know everything the next stage of development in that? And how can we shorten regulatory discussions and speed that up? One of our problems in the pediatric space is that the legislation that has created the mechanisms for both the PIP in Europe and the PSP in the US has a dictated timeline. And it's not a fast process. You know, it's you submit something, you wait a month, you may hear something, then you wait another month and you hear the final thing. And then you have to start over again somehow if you didn't like everything that you got or that you have problems with. And you got to go back to the other side of the Atlantic and figure out what you're going to do. We need to think about how to do that. One of the things I think, that we've done is we've had legislation that's been so specific, it creates barriers to trying to adapt and change things, particularly when you look at certain institutions that also reside here in Washington, D.C. and shall go unnamed. But, we all know it's a problem. So I think we've got to think about how can we do this? I mean, there's a lot of understanding goodwill right now. How can we do this and do it better? And how can we, we're going to need to think about ways to potentially change the legislation that's out there, different approaches like that. But we got to be open to change. We've got to be, brainstorming and really looking at the history of how these things work and what have been problems.
Thanks, AJ. Dan, you're up to bat.
Thank you. I agree with what's been said so far. And I want to basically reinforce this whole idea of communication and collaboration, and with that, increased visibility. And this will involve involvement with legislators, with policymakers, with everyone really. So what I want to shift to right now, just real quickly, is some of the more concrete steps so we can really keep the momentum going from today's meeting. So I'm really thrilled to be part of this panel and with the people that we have here. And I have an additional ask of them, and that is in terms of keeping the momentum going, that and in terms of communication and so forth, that we put together some sort of white paper or other means of keeping this alive and getting the information out there. And I even call upon everyone in the audience to be advocates. And I know you are already, but really these issues that have been raised around pediatric regulations and legislation and so forth, if you could keep them at the front of your mind when you have your meetings, when you have a forum, some type of media, whether it's a website or a meeting, please keep that in mind. So I'm going to pass the mic over.
Thank you, Susie, then Gary, and last word to Stephen.
So I know most people think of the wand like this. I'm the, waving my wand. So I have a couple of things. Absolutely agree with John in terms of the health inequities. I think it's something that we really have to focus on, and glad to support Dan, any efforts with respect to communication and white papers. The two things that really struck me in the discussion today, one from a scientific perspective, is my wish for collaborative, and this means patient-parent advocacy groups, academia, industry, regulators, all coming together to develop sources, and that's natural history sources as well as trial sources of objective, clinically meaningful endpoints that are regulatory, that are acceptable from a regulatory perspective. And I think we need to be focused on that. And I will say that the CPATH Rare Disease COA resource, which was just launched about a month ago, is a tremendous step in that process. And then a little more of a stretch gets to something that Victoria Nicholas was talking about in the last panel, and that's really increasing venture capital and philanthropic spending in order to be able to support these trials. And what this requires is, as Victoria pointed out, this requires education and communication and a shared risk, and that we need to all be working together in this space to make this happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have Gary back on for a quick comment?
Yeah, I'm back. Real quick comment. I just want to further underscore the importance of thinking about ways that we can incentivize this process beyond just the incentives that seem to be largely focused on incentivizing the pharmaceutical companies to stay engaged in this. I'd like to see a future where we have leaders of the healthcare system, deans of medical schools, chairmen of the Department of Pediatrics at key institutions involved in this discussion, asking them what they would view as a meaningful incentive to really change the way that they prioritize the clinical research that's done aimed at getting drugs labeled and approved for children, because I think that's where I've seen the greatest challenges or a great challenge existing, which is not really getting, I think, enough attention right now. So incentivize, but think about ways that we can incentivize all the stakeholders involved in this process. I think that'll have an impact. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Last word to you, Stephen.
Last word. Just following up on what Gary said and based on the tactical issues that really began to drive these discussions, what do we do next? White papers are nice, but they're often not read broadly. More important to me, although having something in writing is going to be important, is to follow up on what Gary said. Before we enact changes in regs, before we enact more legislation, to get data specifically targeted to how and where incentives will change the lives of sick children. I would argue there's a group missing right now, health economists. Yeah. We need to have good health economists with us to discuss things. We need to look at, of the labels that were changed, which really impacted children well, which were delayed because there weren't incentive involved, and how many kids as a result were disenfranchised because the incentives weren't applied. If that's not the issue, that's not what we want to fix. We don't want to fix what's not broken. What we want to do is look at those areas in the lives of the children of this country, and since I chaired ICHE 11 as well, the children of the world, where incentives are going to make a difference. It's very focused. It's very targeted. We can't boil the ocean, but I would say if this group and Critical Path, together with advice from health economists, take a critical look at where we stand right now before stepping off and realizing we've disenfranchised children again, to get the data and figure out where to put the bucks, where to put the people, where to put the effort, and what's going to make the most impact on child health.
Been great comments, and I don't want Klaus to shoot me for running over. So I will just say thank you for very insightful reviews and sharing all of your experience. And we'll make sure that we put together some written summaries as a springboard for actual actions. So thank you all.